Hello and welcome to this video on modelling crime. In this video we're going to be taking a quick look at how economists can use the tools that they've got to look at something like crime and to get some insights from that. To start with, we should say that economists love models. Okay, it's how they explain things, it's how they understand things. So economists try to explain behaviour by building these simplified ways of thinking about how people make decisions. They don't try and think about every tiny little detail of real life. Instead, they focus on the really broad choices that people can make and the key factors that are likely to influence those choices. So for example, when they're trying to understand why prices might change, economists might use simplified diagrams that look at the large forces of demand and supply. And we use those same ideas to help us to study crime. So rather than looking at every single decision that people make and every single factor that goes into decisions about crime, we look at the broad forces that push people either closer to crime or further away from crime. And the most famous economist in this field is probably Gary Becker. So in the 1960s, he wrote about a series of models about crime. Now, it's important that those models don't attempt to judge whether a crime is right or wrong or whether a punishment is fair, but instead it's just looking at how people respond to incentives and to constraints, in the same way that they might respond to incentives and constraints in their decisions to work or to buy things. Now, we start with the assumption that criminals are rational, and that means that they will only commit a crime where the benefits that they're expecting to get are bigger than the costs that they're expecting to receive. So they will only commit a crime if it makes sense to commit the crime, i.e. that they're going to get more out of committing the crime than that they will lose out of committing the crime. But is this how all criminal decisions are made? Are criminals always rational? Well, clearly the answer here is no, because nobody is rational all the time, and there are many crimes that are clearly irrational. So, for example, if people are acting on impulse or addiction or fear, those things might stop people from weighing up the costs and benefits correctly. So in those situations, behaviour doesn't follow this kind of logical decision making that economists assume. So in these cases, that model's not going to be a particularly good representation of real life. However, some criminal behaviour can be analysed as calculated decisions, even if those other crimes can't. And it's important that even in situations where we're not looking at very, very specific, calculated, logical decision making, a lot of the forces that are pushing people towards crime or away from crime stay the same. A really good example of where criminals might be rational is where a criminal is deciding to board a train without paying. In those situations, they may well be thinking about the costs and the benefits, the likelihood of getting caught versus the fine that they might get if they are caught. Now, before we look at the model, we just need to look at a useful bit of maths that's going to help us in our model. So we're going to look at expected values. So expected values is the average payoff. So it takes into account what you could win and how likely it is, so what you could gain and how likely it is. So for example, imagine you're playing a game where you toss a fair coin. And so a fair coin, heads and tails, 50% heads, 50% tails. And you win £100 if it lands on tails. Now each outcome is equally likely. So you're likely to get halfway between 0 and 100, because if it lands on heads, you're going to get 0. If it lands on tails, you're going to get 100. So 50% of the time, or half of the time, you will get a payoff of £100. Therefore, you can expect, on average, to get £50. Now, we know that, of course, in this situation, nobody's getting £50 because they're either getting 0 or 100. But on average, if you did this over and over and over again, that's what you would expect to get per time that you perform this. Let's have a look at some other situations. So, what is the expected payoff if you win £30 if a fair dice lands on 6? Okay, so if you roll a 6, you get £30. So first of all, we need to think, what's the probability that a dice will land on 6? What's the payoff? times them together, and that should get us our expected value. You might just want to pause for a second and just see if you can work that out, just to check that you've got this idea. Okay, so the expected payoff is 1/6 because it lands on 1/6 of the time. The payoff is £30. So 1/6 times 30 gives us an expected payoff of £5 each time. So on average, we can expect to win £5. Let's have a look at the next one. You and 3 friends put your names in a hat. So there are 4 names in the hat. And the first name pulled out loses £10. So this time we're looking at the expected loss. Again, have a look at this. See if you can work out what you're expecting this value to be. Okay, so the probability here is you and 3 friends. There are 4 names in the hat. Therefore, the chance that your name is pulled out first is 1/4. And the loss is going to be £10. So the expected loss is going to be £2.50. We could also write this that there's an expected gain of minus £2.50. Okay, this is going to be helpful for us. So a criminal is incentivized to commit a crime when the benefit is something than the cost. Is it going to be greater than or less than? I want you to have a think about which way do you think that the crocodile, the inequality, is going to be facing? Yeah, okay, so it's when the benefit is greater than the cost. So a rational criminal will commit a crime where the benefit is greater than the cost. And we'll start by looking at the cost side of this equation first. So there are a number of expected costs if you are caught. So if a person's caught, they might face costs such as fines, they might face a prison sentence, they might face a criminal record, which has a cost on our future job prospects, and there's impact on family and friends. So when we're talking about a cost of crime, we're not necessarily talking about stuff that they have to actually pay, although in the case of a fine they do. But the costs can be broader than just monetary costs, and often we can kind of put a value on those sorts of costs. So we're going to simplify all of those costs into one measure, and we're going to call it F, short for fine, but actually it could be any of these things. It's any of the negative effects as a result. But you only pay this punishment cost if you get caught. So let's say the punishment cost is £1,000. Okay, we'll start by saying, what if the probability of being caught is 50%? So let's say that you're getting on a train without a ticket, and getting on a train without a ticket gives you a fine of £1,000 if the conductor comes to you and you don't have a ticket. And in this situation, there's a 50% chance that the conductor will ask for your ticket. So again, I want you to try and work out what the expected punishment is here. Okay, so we've got a 50% probability, so a half probability, or 0.5. Okay, times the punishment cost, which is £1,000. So 50% of the time you can expect to pay £1,000 fine, and therefore the expected punishment is £500. Let's try again if the probability of being caught is smaller, if it's only at 20%. Again, work it out, see what you get. Okay, so this time it's 0.2, 20% is 0.2. You could also just put 20% into your calculator. Times by the punishment cost is still £1,000, and therefore in this situation, on average, you'd be punished £200. Okay. Therefore, we can generalise this expected punishment. And economists love doing this. We love generalising what happens in lots and lots of situations to this more kind of general situation that we can apply over and over again. So the expected punishment is the probability, which we're going to call P, times the punishment cost, which, as you'll remember, we call capital F. So P is the probability of being caught, and F is the cost of that punishment, so what the effect will be. And you can think about that as a fine if that's easier. However, there is another cost that the criminal pays too, because by committing a crime, you give up the chance to do something else. In the time that it takes to, I don't know, rob a bank, or that it would take to steal someone's wallet from their office or something, you could be having a legal job. Okay, there is something else you could be doing with your time. All crime takes time, and there is something else you could be doing with that time. So therefore, we also add the opportunity cost of committing the crime. What else could you be doing with that time, and what could you be earning in that time if you were in a legal profession? So in the time that you could be robbing a house, what could you be doing legally, and what earnings would you get from that? And we'll call that OC, opportunity cost. And therefore, overall, we can give our overall expected costs. However, since you pay the opportunity cost regardless of whether you're caught, so we don't need to adjust this for the probability. Let me just explain that. It's a bit complicated. So let's say I'm robbing a bank, okay? Even if I don't get caught robbing a bank, I'm still giving up the wages that I could have had I worked in a supermarket instead. Robbing a bank takes time to actually go and physically do it. It takes time to plan it. All of that time I could have been working and getting a wage. Okay, and it doesn't matter whether I get caught or not. I'm still giving up that wage. So that's a cost to me that I could have been earning a wage instead. So we've got our expected punishment, which is P times F, and our opportunity cost, which we call OC. So this is the overall expected cost of crime. Okay, we've got the opportunity cost that we pay regardless, and then the punishment cost that we might get if we are caught. Now we'll look at the other side, the expected benefits. So we assume that people commit a crime because they believe that they'll get some benefit. That might be the money that they get from theft or fraud. If you go and steal a PlayStation or something, then you might well end up with that. It could be the costs that you avoid paying, so you benefit by not having to pay for the train ticket. There are also non-financial benefits, status, power, revenge. Sometimes we can associate those particularly with gang crimes and organised crimes. And there's the revenue from selling illegal goods as well. So if you I don't know, if you get some illegal cigarettes and you're selling those, or that you're selling drugs, you get the income from selling illegal drugs. So some of these are clearly easy to be put in monetary terms. Okay, the money that you get from the theft or fraud. So if you steal £1,000, you've ended up with £1,000. That's quite easy to put in money terms. The avoided cost. So let's say you would have paid £38 for a train ticket, then you're benefiting by not having to pay that £38. Similarly, if you earn £100 by selling illegal drugs, then that money coming into you is clearly easy to put in monetary terms. These non-financial benefits, such as status or power or revenge, those are quite difficult for us to put into monetary terms, but it's still useful to think about what would happen if those benefits increased and decreased. Now, without an expected benefit, there'd be little reason to take any risk. So if you weren't going to get a benefit from some crime, you wouldn't do it. So even if you wouldn't necessarily get any money, it might be that you get the benefit in terms of the power or the status symbol or the feeling of revenge. So we assume that there is some benefit. Even in quite irrational crimes, there is some benefit. And we're going to call that B. However, generally, you only get that benefit if you don't get caught. Okay, let's say that you have robbed a house and you're just about to steal a piano. Say, let's say the piano's worth, I don't know, £1,000. You're leaving the house with the piano on your back, and the police are here and you've been caught. They don't let you keep the piano. Okay, so we need to adjust these gains from crime to adjust for the probability that we might get caught. Now, earlier we said that the probability of being caught was P. Okay, therefore we now need to work out the probability of not being caught, because you only get the benefit if you're not caught. So if the probability of being caught was P, and we know that all probabilities add up to 1 or 100%, therefore the probability of not being caught is going to be 1 minus P. So for example, if there's a 25% chance that you will be caught, then the probability of not being caught is 100 minus 25. Which is a 75% chance of not being caught, or 0.75. Okay, so this means that we can write our expected benefits as the probability, which in this case is 1 minus P, the probability that you're not being caught, times the gain from crime, which is B. So these are our expected benefits. And so we need to put these together to work out if this crime is worth doing or not. So a rational criminal would look at the expected net benefit. So they'd take the benefits they're expecting, and they'd take away the costs that they're expecting. Now, if that net benefit is positive, then the benefits are bigger than the costs and it's rational to commit the crime. If the expected net benefit is negative, it would be irrational to commit the crime because you're expecting to lose more than you're expecting to gain. So putting those bits together, we can have our final expected net benefit of the expected benefit, which is 1 minus P, the probability of not being caught, times B, the benefit that we're going to get from committing that crime, minus the cost, which was P times F, so the probability of being caught times the fine if we are caught, and then also adding on that opportunity cost. Now, we're not suggesting that someone is standing there with a calculator outside a house working out whether it's worth their while to commit this crime or not. But these factors, these variables, the size of the benefit, the size of the fine, the likelihood of being caught, the opportunity cost, what they're giving up by committing this crime, they will be thinking about those factors, even if that's not necessarily explicitly. Those factors will be forcing the decision one way or another. Have a look at the simulator mode, which is available for you to take a look at, and you can have a little bit of a play around with it. So looking on basic mode, we've got those variables. So we've got the probability of being detected, which is P. We've got the fine, as you can slide the slider to change the slide. You can also change the fine to imprisonment mode, and that just looks at the equivalent cost to you of going to prison, because obviously if you're going to prison, then you're giving up the money that you could have had while you're in prison, plus having a prison record also affects your future. So it kind of translates the prison time into a monetary factor. You can also change the benefit of crime and also the opportunity cost of crime. And on the side, you should be able to see by looking at those numbers, if those numbers were put into our model, they should give us either a positive expected net benefit or a negative expected net benefit. And you can try this out by hand as well, by putting the numbers into a calculator, and you should see that it will either deter you if you get a negative value, or you will be incentivized to commit the crime if it gives you a positive value. So you can have a look at how that works. The intermediate mode starts to go a little bit further and looks at the costs of detection. So detecting a crime relies on how much surveillance there is, how much policing there is, and therefore by increasing the probability of detection, in order to do that, you're going to have to maybe have more police around, you might have more CCTV, all of those sorts of things, and those things come at a cost. So intermediate mode has an additional graph at the bottom that shows you the cost of increasing those probabilities of detection. In advanced mode, you can go through and we also have information there on the fiscal image to the government and to the public, so the cost to the public of certain crimes. And that's because if you pay a £20,000 fine, let's say, if you're caught, then that money goes into the public pot. However, in order for someone to be put in prison, that costs the public quite a lot of money too. So the advanced mode helps to look at some of those factors as well. But it's all based on this original model that Becker put forward about when someone will be incentivized to commit a crime. Okay, so we can use this model not just to be interested and to help us to work out whether we should commit a crime or not that we should, but it's also useful to help us think what we would need to do to reduce crime. So how would the variables in this formula need to change in order for crime to be reduced? Okay, so in order for crime to be reduced, we need the expected net benefit to be smaller. Okay, that would incentivize less crime. So we need to think, how can we change these numbers to make E and B smaller? I want you to have a think about whether each of these boxes should be increase or decrease. Just have a little look. What do you think would need to increase? What would need to decrease in order for crime to be reduced? Okay, so the probability of being caught would need to increase. That would make the benefit smaller, because then this probability, 1 minus the probability of being caught, would be smaller, and therefore the expected benefit would be smaller. And also the expected cost would be bigger, because you're more likely to be facing that fine. The gain from crime would need to decrease because what they get from crime needs to be smaller. The punishment needed would need to increase, and the opportunity cost would also need to increase. So any of these one changes would decrease the amount of crime. It's great if we can do them all, but even just changing one of those should reduce crime if everything else is kept the same. So that could help us think through actual policies that we could put in place to reduce crime. And lots of these are policies that we already do and that we already have in place. But if we wanted to reduce the amount of crime in a society, we could take action to increase P, to reduce B, to increase F, and to increase OC. I'd like you to just pause the video and try and think of one or two things that you could add in each box. What physically could the government do? What policies could they put in place? Okay, what might it look like if, for example, the probability of being caught was larger? What would that look like? Okay, I'm hoping that you've already had a go at that and you've paused the video and you're now back to compare your answers with mine. Things we could do to increase P. There's lots of things here. So we could have more police patrols. We could have more CCTV so that we can check more easily when a crime has been committed. We could have quicker response times so that if somebody saw you breaking into that house, that the police cars are ready when you leave with the piano on your back. And so that would allow people to be caught quicker. There could also be more detective training so that even after the event of a crime, that you are able to be identified as the criminal. We could also increase F. That could just mean bigger fines. It could be longer prison sentences. In some places, that could even mean capital punishment. Also, things like mandatory minimum sentences. That all of those things increase F. We could increase the opportunity cost of crime. So we could increase the legal wages that people might be getting in those times. So we could have higher wages. For example, we could increase the minimum wage, and therefore the minimum amount that they would be earning in that time would be higher. We could increase access to education and training so that people are able to have higher paying jobs. We could have more general aggregate demand, so that just means that we could have more money flowing around the economy in general, which means that there are more jobs available. When the economy is in a recession, so when the economy dips a little bit, people are then made unemployed, and that's when that opportunity cost is quite low because you're not doing a job anyway. If there are more jobs for everybody in the economy, then there's more chance that you'll have legal wages. We could also increase benefits, and that means that people would have money coming in even without committing a crime. I think the hardest one is this reducing B. But there are a couple of options. So you can make stuff harder to sell when it's illegal or stolen. So for example, we could have tracking. So I think there are ways to write serial numbers on bikes and electronic equipment so that when it's sold, you can check whether actually it belonged to someone else before. You can encourage people to hide valuables. You'll often see signs in car parks encouraging you to hide your valuables. So that just makes it harder to find a car that has valuables in it, and therefore that's reducing the benefits that you're getting. You could discourage shops from keeping much cash in the till. Therefore discouraging if someone comes in and says, give me all the money in the till. If there isn't that much money in the till, then they're going to have that reduced as well. Now, we should say that again, at this point, economists aren't necessarily saying we should do any of this, but we're looking at the mechanisms that would result in reduced crime. Just because these things would result in reduced crime doesn't necessarily mean that we should do them, and we need to look at the costs and benefits and all of the wider impacts of each of these measures. But it is a useful starting point to help us to understand why some things reduce crime. And so overall, these models show us that we can apply economics to all sorts of situations, and it shows us just how broad those situations are. We might also be able to apply these models to things like organ donation or education decisions. So economics isn't really just about money, it's about how we make our choices, and those choices impact on a big scale things like crime. So do have a little play with the model and see what interesting insights you can find.